Good evening, Joshua. Lovely to see you. Thank you so much for taking part in the first Safer, Cleaner Planet series. You're coming in from Boston, Massachusetts. Is that right?
A little west of Boston. Yeah, it's great to be with you. Thanks.
So I just wanted to do a brief introduction. So you are the Professor Emeritus of the International Relations, American University, and Research Scholar of the Department of Political Science of the University of Massachusetts. You're the co-author of the book A Bright Future: How Some Countries Have Solved Climate Change and the Rest Can Follow, which you came to collaborate with the filmmaker Oliver Stone for his new documentary film Nuclear Now, which has been premiered at the Venice Film Festival last September and is due to be released in April, I believe, soon. And you can tell us all about that. So just to start off with, I'd like to ask you, in the film, it features Jane Fonda, the famous icon, anti-nuclear icon, in the 200,000 strong rallies in Madison Park Gardens. Obviously, that was you weren't in your 20s then. Can you tell us about what attracted you first to the nuclear industry and how you felt about nuclear power in your 20s?
Well, I was an anti-nuclear person. I was an environmentalist all my life, and especially at that stage. Well, I still am. And we were all against nuclear power. We thought it represented the intrusion of dirty, overwhelming technology against nature somehow. I've completely changed that view now. But everyone worked on the film. We were all anti-nuclear, and we've all made this journey together. Actually, our public relations person was one of the producers for that anti-nuclear No Nukes concert in Madison Square Garden. So he's come all the way from that to producing this film, which is, of course, pro-nuclear.
So what would you say for you was your kind of light bulb moment? And you obviously said that you
Well,
started as an environmentalist.
I was, yeah, and I still am. But what happened is I had children and I started to think about climate change. And then one of my children became a big climate activist, got elected to the legislature when he was 22. He's now 29 and no longer in the legislature. But he's been pressing me for years and years to do something about climate change. So I started looking into it. I'm a global trends person in international relations. So I do this sort of the big data-based trends in the world. And so climate change is good for that. And I started looking into climate change, not what can we do to take steps here and take steps there and do the things that are comfortable or fit with our other political agendas, but how do we actually solve it? How would we actually make the world okay for my son? And now he's got a baby who's my first grandchild. So she's going to live like 100 years into the future, hopefully. And that's way into the next century. So I'm thinking longer term. It's a whole change in my thinking. And when I started to look into what you could actually do to solve it, it became clear to anybody, which includes me, that likes data or can do some math, that you need nuclear power to do it. You just can't get there without it. So then you got this intermediate phase of I don't like nuclear power, but it looks like we're going to need it. I guess we'll have to live with it. So then I started to learn about it, and I found out most of what I knew about it wasn't true. And I do like it. In fact, I love it. And I think it's the most environmental of all the ways of producing energy. And I do believe the world is going to need a lot of energy more than now. And it's going to be more, not less, over the coming years. And the cleanest way to make it is with nuclear because it's so concentrated that like one little tip of your little finger worth of a uranium pellet has the same energy as a ton of coal. So whether it's coal, hydroelectric, wind, solar, natural gas, they all have a pretty heavy impact on the environment, both climate change and otherwise. And nuclear has by far the least impact because it's so compact that thousands of wind turbines you can produce the same energy with one little nuclear power plant. So that's my evolution on nuclear power.
And have you experienced a shift in attitudes? Obviously there's the Michael Schellenbergers out there, the Xeon lights. What resistance have you experienced as an environmentalist who turned pro-nuclear? What's been your experience
Well, a few,
taking your
yeah,
position? Because you've been extremely brave, obviously, standing out at the beginning.
I don't know, it's so brave, but it was more of a contrarian position at the beginning. And when my book first came out, I would talk about it with friends, and then there would be an awkward silence. And it's not that people have arguments against nuclear power so much as there's a taboo against the whole topic. People just don't want to talk about it. The media won't cover it. All the articles about climate change and fuel sources and renewables generally just don't mention, it's like it doesn't exist. And yet it's the leading clean energy source in the United States and the second in the world after hydroelectric. So that was a few years ago, awkward silences and the taboo. And then in the last year to 2 years, especially since the Glasgow COP summit a year and some ago, there's been a big change of attitude. And then it's been reinforced this past year by the energy crisis, especially in Europe, really all over the world, as the Russian gas came out of the market and suddenly, Germany's reopening coal plants to keep the lights on because they closed their nuclear plants. And that makes it pretty stark.
Yes. So, can you, just going specifically to your book, how did you, and that you co-wrote obviously with Staffan Qvist as well, can you just tell us about how you narrowed the themes down? Obviously with the main approach being on the best performing countries. How did you come to that approach and to address misconceptions and the benefits of nuclear that you thought was being lost in the conversation?
Yeah, so climate change is a really big, really challenging issue, and it's not at all fast or easy to solve. And what I wanted to see was, are there countries that have actually decarbonized their electric grids, that have moved in this path of reducing their carbon emissions? And there are several that fit that. The movie talks more about France, but the book is more about Sweden, partly because my co-author Staffan is Swedish by background. And partly just was a good story how the Swedes just decided to take fossil fuels off their grid and replace them with nuclear power. And they did it because their alternative was to dam more rivers. Sweden has a lot of hydroelectric in the north of the country, and they were going to dam the last free-flowing rivers. The environmentalists said, don't do that, build nuclear plants. So this is an environmental reason behind the whole Swedish move to nuclear. Interestingly, in the United States, similarly, the Sierra Club, up until 1969, had a campaign called Atoms, Not Dams. They, don't dam up beautiful wild canyons, but just do it with nuclear power instead. Then they changed, and that's history. But I wanted to see where it had worked, and then could the world emulate that? And I discovered that Staffan Qvist was writing academic articles on exactly that, how the world could do what Sweden had done. And he's a nuclear engineer, PhD from Berkeley, absolutely knows his stuff, and also as an energy expert more generally on how the grids work and how energy systems work. So that was the technical expertise that I lacked. I had the passion for it on climate change and a good sense of data and world trends and this kind of thing. But I'm not a nuclear engineer. So that was a good partnership. The younger nuclear engineer and the older global trends professor, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, I have obviously read your book. So one of the things that I drew from it the most was the fact that you haven't been contrarian with the renewable energy sector. Obviously, we mentioned the media, and there's a big emphasis in most people's minds that the answer to climate change is renewables. So can you just talk about how you approached this, and you've actually coined this new phrase, newables. Can you explain to the audience what that is in your eyes, how they can complement each other, and perhaps how renewables, without them being aware, perhaps fall short in addressing the challenge of climate change and energy security?
Right. So the category of renewables, I don't even like the category. It doesn't make any sense at all. You've got a variety of different sources of energy that have in common that back 30 to 50 years ago, people thought oil was going to run out and that we needed something sustainable that wouldn't run out like that. And so these were the sources: wind, solar, hydroelectric, geothermal, and biomass that wouldn't run out. But now we know oil's not running out anytime soon. And these sources are wildly different from each other. For instance, cutting down mature forest to burn as biomass is just as bad as burning coal. And yet it's counted as renewable because someday the forest will grow back. It's like this philosophical sort of abstraction about renewables. And then in the kind of energy they produce is also very different because, for instance, geothermal will produce energy regardless of the weather, the time of day, the time of year. That's you call a base load, or round the clock 24/7 source of energy. And nuclear power is the same as that. Hydroelectric is even a little better than that because you can produce at any time, but you can also let the water through the dam when wind and solar are not producing and hold it back when they are. So that's a very versatile, and it's also a very cheap source on the grid. Unfortunately, it's not environmentally friendly because it floods these valleys. So I don't really like it as an energy source, but it's good for climate change. And then what else?
Yeah, so
Wind,
batteries.
well, yeah, the wind and solar are, it's worse than just a part-time kind of solution because you never know when they're going to produce or not produce. So every grid has a peak day of the year, a peak hour when the demand on the grid is the highest. And if you want to keep the lights on at that time, you have to assume that there will be no wind and no solar available at that particular moment. And so you have to back it up with something else. And that something else turns out to be natural gas. So people talk about all wind and solar on the grid, but what it really is wind and solar backed up by natural gas. Now, there's an exception, unless you use nuclear, and that's what I'm getting to. But the exception is if you have a lot of hydroelectric, then you can put wind and solar with hydroelectric power and have more flexibility on the grid, but it's not 100% wind and solar by a long shot. And it depends on being one of the lucky countries that happens to have a lot of hydroelectric. Most places don't. And most of the good places in the world have already been built out. Right now, the Mekong River Delta, or not Delta, but the watershed in Southeast Asia is being built out with hydro. And it's just devastating the ecosystems there. And there's a little bit still to be built in Africa, but most of it is already dammed, the good places. So if you're New Zealand or Norway or Sweden, then you're lucky and you can put hydro into your mix. And it's just easier to get to a decarbonized grid. If you don't have those things, like Germany doesn't have hydroelectric power, and then you need nuclear in your mix. And if you take it out, as Germany's been doing, then you're relying on coal or natural gas to fill the gap. So they took this big gamble in Germany to cut out nuclear and say they were going to produce it, replace it with wind and solar. And then what they're really doing was putting in a lot of Russian gas to keep the grid on. And when that suddenly disappeared, they were in a lot of trouble last year. So the idea of, yeah.
No, I was
Well,
like to ask you
renewables,
about baseload power, about the benefits from a baseload perspective.
Well, you need to be able to keep the lights running regardless of what time of day it is, what time of year it is. And my co-author, Staffan Qvist, did an analysis of energy in Europe a couple of years ago with the question, how long is the longest period in which wind and solar don't produce as much as 10% of their capacity in the entire continent of Europe? And the answer was regularly, infrequently, but with some regularity, 2 weeks. Just 2 weeks where the entire continent doesn't have wind and solar. And you can imagine no battery's going to store that. Your only hope is to have a base load power like hydroelectric, but there's not enough of it to power Europe, or nuclear. So now the geothermal there's some in Iceland, but it's not really tested in other places. And then the biomass is doing a lot of the heavy lifting for what's called renewables in Europe. And it's terrible. They're cutting down forests and burning them. That's the same amount of carbon going into the air as burning coal. And yet they're, posting, we hit our targets for renewable energy because we put in all this biomass. So there's a lot of BS going on behind that term renewables. However, wind and solar have gotten really cheap. I have solar on my roof. I have an electric car in the garage. It's kind of a nice combination. And I've had heat pumps so I can heat the house with electricity. And these are all fine technologies. But the more of it there is on the grid, the harder it is to keep it going. So if you have a grid with 20% wind and solar, that's great. And you can sort of fill in around it with other sources. But if you try to get up above 50%, well, nobody's really done it yet, and get up to 80% or something, then you have to start doing a lot of complicated things to try to keep the grid running with more transmission lines and more batteries and demand, trying to lower demand, get people to use less when the grid is stressed and all this sort of stuff. But with nuclear power being base load means it produces around the clock, any weather, any time of year. And even hydro is subject to droughts. It's like you get the whole thing working and everything's great with this hydroelectric, and then there's a drought and you don't have your hydroelectric. So climate change is changing the wind and the sun and the droughts. But nuclear power just, it's the little engine that could, it just keeps rolling along, producing all the time, 90% of its capacity on average. So it's really good source that way.
So take the US, for example. What would you like to be the ideal mix? I mean, if you were the, Secretary of State for Energy, what would you choose? How would you choose to allocate the energy mix?
I definitely put some wind and solar on because it's a good, cheap source. And there are places where we have plentiful resources for that. Not Massachusetts, where we're cutting down forests to put in solar arrays in my town. And I'm not very happy about it. But, Arizona, New Mexico, California, places with a lot of sun, definitely you want some of that. But I would say below 30%, I'm sort of making that number up, but, not trying to do a majority with that. It's more of a fill-in thing to get cheap electricity at the times when you can, but not count on it to keep the grid running. And then you can put in some batteries with that. I'm not a big believer in batteries because they're expensive and they're also environmentally destructive. And then hydroelectric, we have some in the United States. That's a good source. Keep that running. And then for lack of a better number, I'd say half nuclear. That's the renewables, like half nuclear and half hydro, wind, and solar and whatever else. I like geothermal, but it's not proven yet in places other than sitting on top of a volcano. But if that comes along, it's great. If fusion comes along sooner than we expect, which is still decades away that we expect, that would be great. And anything else, I'm all for investing in all of these technologies.
Thank you. So
miracle batteries, it's all good. But if you want something proven to keep your grid running and you want it fast because climate change is staring us in the face, then a lot of nuclear is what I would say.
Thank you. So just going back to the documentary Nuclear Now, can you address the things which are in the forefront of most people's minds who perhaps aren't up to speed with the latest technologies and safety measures, about the particular three incidents that are, the 3 Mile Island being one of them, Chernobyl and Fukushima. Can you tell us about how your book and the documentary address that, and to give a little summary, if you like, in this podcast?
Sure. I said I'm someone who likes data, and if you look at the data on how many people are killed for every megawatt hour of electricity that you produce through different means, nuclear is the safest source, the safest way to generate electricity. And especially compared to coal, it's hundreds of times safer. And that means coal is killing people every day routinely because the particulate matter that gets out the smokestack then gets into people's lungs and causes cancer, emphysema, heart disease, horrible diseases, terrible suffering that it causes, in addition to being so bad for climate change. So nuclear has had one fatal accident in the whole 70-year history, and that was the accident at Chernobyl. It's a badly designed reactor without a containment structure, which is supposed to hold radiation in if anything goes wrong. And they didn't have that, and the radiation went out. Then they sent unprotected people or inadequately protected people right in with shovels to go scooping up stuff and fight the fire. And they got massive doses, really high doses of radiation, and about 50 of them died from it. And then the local communities got radiation, and there were some cancers and some more people died. If you add it up, it's about a few hundred people died from the Chernobyl accident. Then low-level radiation spread around Europe, and you can see the maps of where radiation is spreading everywhere. But that's low level, and you can measure radiation at very low levels, below background radiation. But it doesn't hurt people. That's a long story. Maybe another film needs to be made on that. But we go into it a little bit in the movie about low-level radiation and how the fossil fuel industries originally tried to make us all afraid of low-level radiation, because then nuclear power would be very hard to build. But the accidents at 3 Mile Island in the United States and Fukushima in Japan, the other two famous accidents, didn't kill anybody. The radiation never got out at 3 Mile Island because the containment structure did what it was supposed to do and kept it in the plant. Now we've got like these whistleblowers on Netflix shows and stuff that say, oh no, everybody got cancer from radiation. Well, we know that's not true. There were radiation detectors all over town, and it was all very carefully monitored. And we know that it didn't get out, didn't hurt anybody. In Fukushima, it did get out because everything went wrong there. The 100-foot tsunami was the cause of all the 18,000 people died from the tsunami and earthquake. And when it hit most of the power plants, they were fine. But the problem one at Fukushima had too low of a seawall, and this 100-foot tsunami came in and flooded everything. The backup generators, diesel generators, were flooded because they were in a low-lying place. So the electricity went out. So then everything overheated and melted down. Then hydrogen gas built up and exploded in the building, and radiation got out from the containment. So that's about as bad as it gets, right? Like a 100-foot tidal wave. Everything goes wrong, and it ends up with an explosion, and radiation got out. But the radiation that got out was, again, so low level that it didn't actually harm anybody. And, they measured everybody's radiation, what they were exposed to, didn't hurt anybody. So here we have the 18,000 people killed by an earthquake and tsunami, nobody killed by a nuclear plant, but everybody, all they remember is, the nuclear accident, the nuclear disaster. It's a disaster even though nobody died. So it's really a weird way of thinking about it. And I think we cross-wired it in our brains as though the nuclear plant somehow caused the earthquake and tsunami. Obviously not true, but in our brains, they're associated. And similarly, in the 3 Mile Island plant, the accident happened just as the Jane Fonda's film, The China Syndrome, was in theaters. And so we associated the disaster in the film and all the fear factor from the film with the real world accident. So we get these associations, but it comes down to one bad accident 40 years ago, a few hundred people killed. That's bad, right? But just nothing as bad as what coal does routinely, or natural gas, or any other oil, these sources that kill people regularly.
Can you just say something also about the association that people make in their minds, maybe of nuclear weapons as well? I think in the film it does address that, and nuclear power, nuclear weapons, civil nuclear. How do you try and tackle that in the book and the film, the documentary?
Well, a little bit differently in the book than the film. In the book, it's just treated as one of the sort of problems to be addressed, or issues that people are afraid of. So there's a chapter on how do we handle the waste? There's a chapter on, can people make nuclear weapons with this technology? And, these kind of things. In the film, it's more central because we start out with the fear of the weapons. And this was my generation, the baby boomers, who grew up in the early Cold War, hiding our heads under the desks in drills in case missiles arrived at a moment's notice and blew up us, our schools, our communities, everything, all of civilization could all be destroyed at a moment's notice. And that was a huge collective trauma, and formed the basis of all the fears about nuclear power that would follow that, even though nuclear power is not the same as nuclear weapons. It's got the same word in it, nuclear, and it is the same technology of splitting atoms. It was a tragedy that the fission was first understood in 1938, just at the outset of World War II, the biggest, worst war in human history. And had it been discovered at some other time, I think the results would have been much more positive. But as it is, the first thing we did with it, it was to make a bomb and use it because it was desperate times, World War II. So then after the war, there was this idea to use nuclear power, especially President Eisenhower's idea of atoms for peace. We'll use nuclear power to further economic development in the world. It'll be a force for peace. And that was somewhat successful. But at the same time, there was a big campaign also in the 1950s against atmospheric nuclear weapons tests. They were just blowing off nuclear weapons like popcorn in the atmosphere on the ground just to, study the effects and build bigger bombs. And that was spreading radioactive fallout around. So the people who were against that and wanted to stop the arms race thought if they could make people afraid of radioactive fallout, which again goes back to this fear of low-level radiation, then it would help stop the arms race. Well, it didn't stop the arms race. It did lead to moving all those tests underground so that they wouldn't create fallout. Eventually, the arms race went up and went down. And meanwhile, the nuclear industry got going, but people were always afraid that it was somehow connected.
So, moving to a much more positive paradigm. So, what do you really believe is the power of nuclear and its potential for solving climate change, and particularly to do with the technologies that you find most exciting? And the film, obviously, towards the middle of the documentary, does discuss small modular reactors. So, can you just make a distinction for the audience of large nuclear plants and now this new paradigm shift to the potential of small modular reactors?
Sure. There's the large reactors are like big construction projects, like building a metro or an airport or a bridge or this kind of thing, big concrete laying projects. And all of those in the Western countries have gone hugely over budget and behind schedule for some time now. China can build them. And China is putting nuclear plants on the grid every 2 to 3 months, big plants like the ones we don't seem to be able to build anymore. So the idea of the shift is to make smaller plants that you can build in factories, shifting from construction to manufacturing. Factories or shipyards, better yet, where you build the same product over and over again, the same people, the same machinery to build it, everything, standardized, and then you ship it out the door, drop it into a hole on site where it's going, put a building over it, and you've got a nuclear plant, right? That's a little simplified, but you get the idea. And so there are now 3 sizes of plants, and there's a whole spread, but the big ones, the traditional ones, are gigawatt or more of power, and we're used to those. Those are the big. They're associated with the cooling towers, but a lot of them don't have cooling towers. A lot of coal plants do have cooling towers. So it's an interesting misunderstanding. But then the smaller ones are, a third of that size typically. I think Rolls-Royce is almost half. It's like 400. They go down to 200 or so, but it's the idea of something small enough to build centrally and then assemble at the site. And then there is a third category of what's called microreactors, which are anywhere from 1 to 20 megawatts. So in other words, 1,000 at the low end, 1,000 times smaller than the typical big nuclear plant. And the 20, which seems to be the more popular size as we move along, is we have 50th the size of the big one. So it's a lot smaller. And the good thing about them is you can really make them in factories, ultimately put them in shipping containers, send them where they're going, plug them into the grid. And there are a number of companies doing this right now. I could go down the list, but a couple of prominent ones. The U.S. military is building this right now at Idaho National Laboratory with a completion date of, I think, less than 2 years from now. So the smaller ones, they're faster to build. We'll get them on the grid faster. Of course, it's a lot less electricity. But then you can put it on the grid, start selling electricity, take that money to build the next one and so forth. Whereas the big ones, the big problem is you need to raise like billions of dollars and then wait a decade to go through all this site licensing and stuff. And that's a hard way to make money, because especially when interest rates are above zero, which they now are, you got to borrow all this money and then pay interest for a decade before the thing ever happens. The small one, borrow a lot less money, wait a couple of years, put it on the grid. So the military loves this idea of the small reactor that can fit in a shipping container because they have logistics issues. I always think of the mountain passes in Afghanistan where they were trying to send fuel convoys to their forward bases and they're just getting picked off. So having a nuclear plant in a shipping container at a forward base or any military base is good, especially a remote place. They're also really good for remote communities like in Alaska or northern Canada, places where there's mining going on, where it's hard to even get diesel in the winter.
Because the ones
So
I've been aware of, are in terms of new small modular reactors, is the Darlington site in Ontario, which is supposed to be completed around 2029, and that would be a GE Hitachi small modular reactor. And then there's the one which is going to be built in Oak Ridge in Tennessee. So why do you think GE Hitachi is ahead of the game on this? How did they get first to market, do you think? And
well, they were
with X Energy as well behind, and then TerraPower. Maybe you could just address those.
Right. So GE has been in the nuclear business since the early days, and this one you're referring to that they're building in Canada is the 10th generation boiling water reactor. So it's called BWRX, and the X stands for 10th generation boiling water reactor, BWR. So they've really worked out a lot of the kinks in it, right? And they have the fuel is all standardized, supply chains, fuel issues. These are nightmares for a lot of the new companies. Where are we going to get fuel from? And it's like, no problem, we'll get it from Russia. And then it's like, oh, wait, we can't get it from Russia anymore. So this is set back. You mentioned TerraPower, just set back 2 years because they can't get the fuel they need. So GE has that going. And then they decided to build it in Canada first and not the United States because the Canadian nuclear regulator is a lot more reasonable. It's more technical, and the US one is more capricious and political, for lack of a better word, but it's a harder process to go through. So they went
what
up to
kind
Canada.
of megawatts are we talking for the GE actually?
300 for the GE.
So what gives a sense of scale? Would that be a whole town or a whole city that could, or what's the scale of electricity generation that can?
Small, well, like a gigawatt plant is a city, medium-sized city. So this is, a few of these would do a city. I think I figured out for the state of Massachusetts, you could, the nice thing is you can spread these around more on the grid and not have it all in one place the way a big plant would be. And that's easier on the grid. And so I was looking at how you would do that in Massachusetts, and it was a few dozen of them to, for the whole state.
And my understanding is it's not just electricity generation, it's also heat generation that the small modular reactors can generate as well, which is new.
Especially with the microreactors, the smaller the reactor, the closer in you can get it to where the demand is. And ultimately, especially with these very small ones, like a 20 megawatt reactor, you can put it behind the grid, behind the meter, where, there's an industrial facility, like let's take Dow Chemical is producing these products that need plastics and all this kind of industrial product that needs a lot of energy. So they can put a microreactor right there in the factory and produce the heat for the factory for industrial use, the heat to heat the building with, and the electricity to run on. And that's what Dow has just arranged to do with this company, X Energy, that you just mentioned.
And
It's
how
a
different is their
100
reactor from the GE Hitachi one?
megawatt. It's a newer reactor. GE's very traditional light water reactor, and the X Energy uses a different fuel. It's like billiard balls, and they circulate around in the reactor, and it's super safe because it's all caked into the billiard ball. It can't melt down. It can't go anywhere or do anything. But the billiard balls are close enough to get the chain reaction and heat up.
Is that called a high temperature gas cool reactor, or is that different?
It is, well, there's there's about 15 or 20 types, and this is a version of a high temperature um, pebble bed reactor. It's called this. They call these billiard balls pebbles because that's the scale they're thinking of. Compared to a big reactor, these are little things.
But on the safety side, there's no chance of it.
Super safe. But what's great for Dow Chemical, so there's two of these new reactors that the energy department is putting money in to build. One is the Natrium. It's also a GE Hitachi, but in partnership with Bill Gates's company TerraPower, and the other is this X Energy that was started by an entrepreneur from the space program and uses these billiard balls. And so they were going to build this billiard ball one out in Washington State at an existing nuclear power plant. And then they've just pulled the plug on that and instead made this deal with Dow Chemical to go into the Dow plant on the Gulf Coast. And Dow has a lot of these plants. And so there's a big market there.
That makes sense.
For that. The other one I'd call out for your attention because it's a little under the radar. Well, two of them are under the radar. One is the Westinghouse eVinci. Westinghouse, along with GE, is the other company that's been doing these things for decades and decades in the United States. But the eVinci is a microreactor, and they're a little bit quiet about it compared to the other ones. I guess they're not raising capital the way a startup is, so I don't need to yell about it. But it's coming along really nicely. And that may be the first one out of the gate after this military one at Idaho. The second company, also a little bit under the radar, is Holtec, Holtek, which is an old nuclear fuel and sort of, industry company, not one that has built reactors traditionally. And they've been buying up sites of reactors that close, and there's a pool of money. When a nuclear plant in the United States generates electricity, as it goes along, it has to put aside money for decommissioning. And that turns into a nice pool of money over time. And so when they close down, Holtec's been coming in and getting that money and doing the decommissioning, which they're good at and can do for cheaper than was expected. So that's a source of revenue. But then they've now created their own small modular reactor in addition, which is 160 megawatts. And it has various nice features, but it's basically a smaller version of that GE light water reactor. But they've now figured out how to modify the output of the steam, the temperature and the pressure of the steam, so that that reactor can match the output of a coal boiler in a coal power plant. So it opens up the possibility, if you're following me here, that you can take an existing coal plant anywhere in the world and take out the coal boiler and the big piles of coal, but leave the whole rest of the plant, the turbine, the grid connections, the cafeteria, the parking lot, the administration, everything there, the jobs for the coal plant, workers, but substitute in this new way of boiling water with these Holtec 160s. And you can add it up to 320, 640, whatever matches the coal plant output. And so you're producing something that looks just like coal to the grid, which is good because that's what, the grid is set up for right now. There's all these coal plants in the world. It's our leading source of making electricity in the world is through burning coal. And the idea that you can just keep the plant but sub in the reactor means it's going to be really cheap. So coal to nuclear conversion is top of my list for climate change. And I think Holtec has a really good solution to that. Who knows? All of these Some of them are going to work. Some of them are not going to work. Some of the companies are going to go bankrupt. Others are going to make big piles of money, but we have to do them and try it and see what works.
Absolutely. So just going back to your journey with promotion of Nuclear Now, tell us about, the last year working with Oliver Stone and which countries did you have the best reception? How have you seen the shift in attitude potentially with the media, for example, that you mentioned before? And if you could address like the next generation influences as well that perhaps are coming into play now with the documentary making a big change.
Right. So just starting on that point, there are a number of young people now that are organizing as a pro-nuclear force in the world. We feature one of them in the film named Isabel Bomaki. She does TikTok videos about nuclear. They're funny, they're, lively, fast. And she can get like 500,000 views on these videos, which is more than my books sell, to say the least. Of course, they're short. It's a different
She's
product,
a
but she's great. And there's a group called Generation Atomic, and a number of them that are, getting organized. The young people are really concerned about climate change, and they're not terrified about nuclear.
Oh, we've just lost you there. Is that our
I'm
end?
sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
No, I think
We're
it was
here.
my end. I was
Carry on.
fiddling with my little, am I on?
You're on.
Okay.
Carry on.
So the younger people are less scared about nuclear war and more scared about climate change than the older people. So we're trying to reach them with the film. Now, working with Oliver Stone was an exciting adventure the last 3 years. He said, let's make a documentary about your book. And then, a year later, he said, you've ruined my life because it was so hard to make it. He says it was the hardest documentary that he made. And I spent a couple of years scratching my head, like, what's so hard about this? Like, I understand it. But the trouble was that my book is it's not too technical. You can read it as a layperson, but it is full of numbers and graphs and data. That's, as I say, that's what I love. So we had this early moment where I said, I'm a graph person. And Oliver Stone said, I'm not a graph person. I don't like graphs. I don't understand them. Right. So he had to take this technical topic and turn it into a human story and a story about humanity, not something about numbers. And so he'd go around and around. How do we tell it? How do we tell the story? And he'd put in a lot of numbers to try to like compensate for the fact that he didn't like the numbers. And I'd be like, no, we have to tell the story. So I think it turned out well. It is a story. It's about the past and future of human beings and this incredible energy source, what happened to it, what it could do for us. And it turned out okay. So until we put it in front of an audience, nobody knew if it was any good or not. But we brought it to Venice to the film festival last fall and showed it to a big theater with 1,000 people in it. And we got a 10-minute standing ovation. Admittedly, Italians are enthusiastic about cinema, but still, that was a good sign. Yes, it is a good film. And we've showed it a number of times since then, and just got, including once that you put on a screening, and we got a great reception to it. So I think we're on the right track.
And how do you think that's changed with emerging nuclear states? Do you think that now we've heard that, like Poland, for example, is going to be hopefully planning 79 reactors? Is that correct? Do you think your films help to influence these new nuclear states?
I like to think so, especially the book was translated into Polish right after it was translated into Swedish. And then it was also translated into Dutch. And those are all countries that are now talking about building new reactors. So, that's good. It's obviously everybody's work on this in their own ways, and it's adding up because it makes sense. So Poland is the most coal dependent of the major European economies, and it's just a big polluter with coal. And of course, it's a big killer through its health effects. So they're if you take the taboo off of nuclear, suddenly the people in Poland are really interested in it. Like, this is really good. We should do this. So they're going to build a number of the gigawatt reactors, and a bunch of the SMRs they're in negotiations about. And then they want to put these little 20 megawatt things into their factories, the same way Dow Chemical is doing. There's a couple of companies working on that with them. So that's great. And the film, where it has been shown, it hasn't really had its effect yet because we've only shown it in selective places, but
So
I
tell
have
us
high
about the
hopes.
launch. So
Yeah,
now it's coming to the public. So what's the
yeah.
plan there?
So first, we're launching in the United States on April 28th. It's a limited theatrical release. So New York, LA, and a few other cities will have it in theaters for at least a week. We'll see how it goes. A sort of regular theatrical release. And then on 3 days later, on 4 days later, on May 1st, we're having Nuclear Now Day. And that evening, May 1st, a couple of cases a few days later, it will be in all 50 states in at least 100 theaters. And so people can go to the website for the film, which is nuclearnowfilm.com, and sign up and figure out where your closest theater is going to be when it does come out in those theaters. We hope to fill up those theaters, and we're doing a lot of outreach to try to let people know about that. We're doing a few special screenings right around then, one at Harvard University in early April with a 350-seat auditorium there full of Harvard students, and we'll see how that goes, because that hasn't been very nuclear friendly territory up until now, but I think it will be. And then we're doing a screening on May 1st, Nuclear Now Day, in Washington, D.C., close to Capitol Hill, and we have a lot of interest in the Congress, which tends to be pro-nuclear, especially these advanced reactors, on both sides of the aisle. So both Republicans and Democrats support these new reactors, from pretty far left to pretty far right on the spectrum. It's not a partisan issue. It's not one that's being used to bash the other party with, and that's really good. That's
Yeah, I think that's very
positive.
positive
Yeah.
too. That's really excellent. So just to finish off with the global leaders, the champions of nuclear, who stands out to you today to take the baton forward for nuclear? And what do you think in terms of the Americans leading the way in the field? Do you think that the film has achieved its success? What was really the ultimate goal for you and Oliver, do you think, with the Nuclear Now? Do you feel that you've achieved what you set out to do?
Well, we don't know yet till it's released, and we'll see how it does and what kind of impact it has. But we're set up now. There's a company called Participant Media that is working with us on impact, how to make an impact with the film. They did An Inconvenient Truth and films like that, so they've done this kind of thing before. I didn't mention that there will be international distribution as well, but the dates haven't been set yet, so it's going to follow after the U.S. And we'll see if it has the desired effect. So far, in terms of who's leading, well, the Chinese are building more than anyone right now. The Russians have the most advanced technology. And it's too bad, because we're not cooperating with either of them now, and it's set back. Like Bill Gates's company first was going to work in China, got set back by having to leave that, and then was going to get their stuff from Russia, and set back by that. It would be better if we lived in a more cooperative world. But as for the rest of the world, France is the leader. They have a very clean grid, way cleaner than Germany or most other countries. Britain is pretty far in the lead, been doing nuclear a long time, has a good regulatory agency, and is its own company, Rolls-Royce, making it SMR, and maybe some other ones, and the intention to build more. And I would say Macron in France is also intending to build more. Sweden was getting away from nuclear, but now there's a new government that wants to get back in and build for export. Finland is doing great, although their first big new reactor was one of those that was way over schedule and budget, but they finished it now.
From an investment point of view, one of the biggest challenges is not only on the regulatory side that there could be delays because the regulators aren't up to speed with the technological changes, which of course Canada seems to be championing well, but also unlocking the capital. So, we do know that a small modular reactor could be around the cost of $2 billion plus. So it's not small money compared with perhaps what the capital that's required for renewable energy projects, wind or solar. So I think, do you feel that from your conversations in this last year that the investment community now are looking at this with new interest?
Definitely.
With the Biden administration and different leaders of different countries now, kind of almost like that taboo is being removed, and now people are looking at it as a genuinely, an investment that they would be more willing to make.
Starting to be. The taboo starting to be removed, and the Biden administration's doing good stuff. The Trump administration also was good on nuclear, and so was the Obama administration. But Biden's been better than before and putting more resources in. Jennifer Granholm in the Energy Department's been fantastic, very pro. And I didn't quite make the loop around from China, Russia, Europe to get back to the United States, where we're behind on building. We have 2 plants being finished in Georgia, and that's it. Nothing in the pipeline except this little thing in military's making in Idaho. But the United States is really good at innovation. And so, the new reactors are probably going to come out of the United States before anywhere else. So I'm hopeful about that.
Yeah, so you've got catching up to do, but everything's in place. So you think
as far as the investment goes, there is a lot of interest by investors now, especially the smaller reactors, because there isn't this problem of, raise $10 billion and wait a decade, but raise less money and make it go faster. It's more appealing. The micro reactors, I'm really pretty keen on because, $10-20 million, wait a year or two, put it on the grid, build factories, crank them out, and get them to right where the energy's going. By the way, economically, if you can put a nuclear reactor behind the meter in a factory, it means you can sell the electricity at retail price, right? Not like you put it on the grid somewhere and then it has to go through all this, expensive transmission and storage and all these things that the grid has to do. So it's a good economic model that way.
Absolutely.
And then if you can take the heat off the reactor, which is now being thrown away almost everywhere, and use it to heat buildings. Some places like Sweden and China are using it for district heat, meaning to heat a neighborhood, but very few using it for industrial heat. Also making hydrogen, nuclear, the new higher temperature reactors are going to be really good at making hydrogen. So to the extent that's part of our energy system, nuclear is well suited for that, much better than wind or solar or the existing older nuclear plants, which all, the older nuclear runs not quite hot enough, and the wind and solar don't make heat. So it's hard to make hydrogen with just electricity.
Yes.
Anyway, and then also desalination and, making steel and concrete. And there's just a lot of different uses we go into at the end of the film of the innovative stuff. But it's a little further out there in the future than, build a reactor today and generate electricity.
Well, thank you so much, Joshua, for taking us through the latest. We have in the UK Great British Nuclear, which is a plan to deploy here. So we will be very closely following the new plants that are being built in Canada and in the US. So we'd love to invite you back when those plants are perhaps, already further down the line, to just get your thoughts on that and any developments that happen after Nuclear Now Day. So we would love to talk to you again. And I just want to say thank you so much for championing the nuclear industry, because as a climate advocate and somebody who, really wants to see clean energy throughout the world and thinks it is possible, you've done an amazing job. So thank you so much for giving us your time. And we will circle back with you in hopefully a few months' time.
Yeah, thanks a lot. For
Thank
sure,
you.
we'll be back in Britain when the international release happens there. So
That's great. Well,
we'll see you then.
we wish you all the very best. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Okay.
You too.
You take
Yeah,
care. Bye bye.
you too. Bye bye.